The email arrived at 9:14 on a quiet Tuesday morning while I was reviewing a holiday campaign calendar for a regional retail client. The subject line looked harmless enough. Confirmation of trust activation, Montgomery Growth Trust. I almost deleted it. But then I saw my name. Co-signer, Elizabeth Harper. Beneficiary, Danielle Monroe. Initial funding, $150,000. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. What tightened in my chest wasn't the amount. Kevin's startup had seen larger numbers on good months. It was the sentence buried halfway down the confirmation. All required parties have electronically consented. I had not consented to anything. Kevin was in San Francisco, supposedly finalizing meetings with potential investors. He had kissed me goodbye 2 nights earlier and told me he was building something that would secure our future. He had smiled when he said it. The truth was sitting in my inbox. My husband had opened a trust fund for another woman. And somehow, my signature was attached to it. What Kevin didn't know, what he could not possibly have calculated, was that I was not just his wife. I was the legal co-signer. And I knew exactly what that meant. I read the email 3 times before I moved. The house was quiet. Sunlight sliding across the hardwood floors of our townhouse in Charlotte. Nothing about the morning felt dramatic. No shattered glass. No raised voices. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint clicking of my mouse. I opened the attached PDF. There it was. My name in crisp digital ink at the bottom of a 20-page trust agreement. The Montgomery Growth Trust. Structured for strategic wealth preservation. Beneficiary listed as Danielle Monroe, 34. Digital data sales executive. The signature looked real because it was real. I recognized the slight curve in the H of Harper. The narrow tail on the final R. It had been lifted from somewhere. I scrolled down further. Funding source. Distribution from marital business profits derived from Kinetic Loop Technologies. Kevin's mobile productivity app startup. Marital business profits. A pulse thudded once in my throat. I checked the timestamp on the document. Uploaded 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. Kevin had been home every night, complaining about delayed investor calls and pretending to be exhausted. I clicked into the metadata section. Uploaded from Kevin's user account. I didn't cry. I didn't call him. I didn't slam my laptop shut. Instead, I opened our shared cloud archive. 7 years ago. We refinanced our mortgage. I remembered signing stacks of paperwork at our dining table. Kevin joking about adulting and interest rates. I searched the folder labeled Refinance Documents. Within seconds, I found the scanned copy of my signature, saved neatly in a PDF bundle. The trust document used the exact same image. He hadn't even altered the resolution. I leaned back in my chair and let the realization settle. This wasn't an impulsive mistake. This was planned. Structured. Timed. I searched our joint banking account next. Over the past 4 months, there were recurring transfers labeled Consulting Retainer. The payments went to a Delaware-based LLC with an unfamiliar name. The amount started modest, then increased gradually. 4 months ago was when Kevin started guarding his phone like it held classified information, when he began locking the home office door, when he spoke about asset optimization and liability shielding as if those phrases were affectionate terms. "You trust me?" "Right," he had said one evening, holding eye contact just a second too long. I trusted him enough not to question the language. Now I understood it. I searched the Delaware Business Registry. The LLC was registered to Danielle Monroe. Formation date: 3 months ago, 5 days before the trust paperwork was drafted. Danielle. I pictured her at the last product demo dinner, leaning slightly too close to Kevin while discussing growth projections. I had dismissed it as enthusiasm. She was confident, polished, ambitious. Kevin had introduced her as critical to long-term expansion. Her name appeared again in the trust agreement under a secondary title, Strategic Growth Liaison. This wasn't just an affair. This was financial architecture. He wasn't planning to leave emotionally first. He was planning to move assets before I knew there was a war. I reopened the trust agreement and scrolled to the final page. Beneath the formal legal language, There was a section labeled Internal Notes. It was meant for trustee coordination. Most of it was technical. Funding phases, release triggers, compliance checkpoints. Then I saw a sentence that didn't belong to legal formatting. When the trust finalizes, everything is protected. Protected from what? From me. I closed the document and stared at my reflection in the darkened laptop screen. 35 years old. Social media manager. 12 years married. No children by choice. We had built what looked like a stable. Modern partnership from the outside. A townhouse in a quiet suburb. 2 strong incomes. Mutual ambition. He must have believed I wouldn't read closely. That I wouldn't understand the mechanics. That complexity would shield him. My phone buzzed. A text from Kevin. Big things happening. You'll thank me soon. I looked back at the trust confirmation email. At Danielle's name. At my stolen signature. Kevin thought he had weeks before I noticed. He didn't realize the system had automatically sent confirmation to the cosigner on file. He didn't realize I was still that cosigner. And he certainly didn't realize that I had already started following the money. I didn't confront Kevin that night. When he called from San Francisco, I answered on the second ring and asked about his meetings like nothing inside me had shifted. He sounded energized. Almost boyish. He talked about potential valuation bumps. About strategic expansion. About how the right investor could change everything for us. For us? I stirred pasta on the stove and told him that sounded promising. I even smiled when he said, "Big things happening. You'll thank me soon." After we hung up, I wiped the counter, loaded the dishwasher, and sat down at the dining table with my laptop. If he was building something in silence, so was I. I logged into our joint banking dashboard and filtered transactions over the past 4 months. At first glance, nothing dramatic stood out. Mortgage, utilities, standard operating transfers from his startup account. Then I narrowed the search by external transfers above $5,000. There they were. Recurring payments labeled consulting retainer. The amount started at $10,000, then $15,000, then $25,000. The most recent was $32,000. Each transfer sent to a Delaware-based entity. Meridian Data Strategies, LLC. The name meant nothing to me at first. I opened a new tab and searched the Delaware Business Registry. Meridian Data Strategies, LLC. Registered Manager. Danielle Monroe. Formation date. 3 months ago. 3 months ago was when Kevin started talking about restructuring ownership tiers. I pulled up the transaction dates and cross-referenced them with Kevin's investor trips. Each spike in consulting payments aligned perfectly with a trip out of state. Chicago, Austin, San Francisco. He wasn't just meeting investors. He was redirecting money. My chest felt tight, but my hands stayed steady. I exported the transaction history into a spreadsheet. Date, amount, destination. I highlighted the trust activation date in yellow. The consulting payments had increased the week before that trust was drafted. I leaned back and replayed the past 4 months in my mind. Kevin locking the home office door. Kevin taking calls on the balcony instead of in the living room. Kevin using phrases like asset shielding and liability protection as if he had suddenly enrolled in law school. One night, while we were watching television, he had casually asked, "You still have access to the old refinance documents, right?" I had shrugged and said they were in the cloud somewhere. He had nodded too quickly. Now I understood why. I opened our shared cloud archive again and navigated to the refinance folder from 7 years ago. I downloaded the original PDF and compared it side by side with the trust agreement. The signature block was identical. Same pixel pattern. Same faint blur on the lower edge. He hadn't forged my handwriting. He had copied it. The trust agreement had one more detail I hadn't examined closely before. Under the electronic consent section, there was a checkbox labeled Spousal Confirmation via automated email. That box was marked completed. Completed because I had received the confirmation email. The system assumed consent if no dispute was filed within a designated window. Kevin must have believed I wouldn't read it in time. I returned to the banking spreadsheet and ran totals. Over 4 months. The consulting payments exceeded $120,000. Combined with the trust's initial funding, the number climbed higher than I expected. This wasn't symbolic. It was structural. I opened Kevin's desktop folder remotely through our shared drive. Most of his startup files were encrypted, but he had a habit of saving drafts in visible directories before finalizing them. There it was, a document titled Separation Strategy, Q3. My pulse thudded once. I opened it. The first page outlined phased asset movement before formal divorce proceedings. Bullet points. Clean formatting. Clinical language. Transfer growth upside before filing. Reclassify projected equity. Limit exposure through consulting allocations. My name appeared only once, under a section labeled Settlement Modeling. It projected a significantly reduced payout scenario if revenue diversion was completed before valuation reassessment. He wasn't improvising. He was modeling outcomes. I scrolled further and found a draft amendment to our original prenup. The amendment attempted to redefine startup equity growth as personal intellectual expansion rather than marital appreciation. The document wasn't signed. It was dated 2 weeks ago. He hadn't shown it to me yet. I imagined the conversation he might have planned. Maybe during a celebratory dinner. Maybe after a supposed investor win. Maybe framed as housekeeping. I closed the document and stared at the ceiling. Kevin always handled the technical architecture of his company. I handled branding, digital messaging, contracts with marketing vendors. He had once joked that he built the engine and I made it look pretty. He must have believed I didn't understand the mechanics. But contracts are contracts. Whether they describe brand licensing or equity dilution, language leaves trails. Numbers leave footprints. I reopened the trust agreement one more time and zoomed in on the funding structure. It was labeled Phase 1. Phase 1 implied there was a Phase 2. I returned to the separation strategy document and searched for that phrase. There it was. Phase 2. Offshore buffer exploration. My stomach dropped. Not from panic, but from clarity. He was preparing layers. I checked the file properties. Last edited 3 days ago. While he was home, while we were eating dinner across from each other. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Kevin. Once this closes, nothing can touch us. I looked at the spreadsheet on my screen. The consulting transfers. The trust activation. The separation modeling. Nothing can touch us. He wasn't protecting us. He was protecting himself from me. I forwarded the separation strategy file to a new encrypted folder and labeled it Evidence. Kevin thought complexity would keep me quiet. He didn't realize I was already reading between the lines. It stopped being about an affair the moment I saw her title inside the trust agreement. Strategic Growth Liaison. That wasn't the language of a secret romance. That was the language of structure. I had met Danielle Monroe at least a dozen times over the past year. She worked in digital data sales for one of Kevin's startup partners. Polished. Precise. Confident in the way women are when they know their value in a room full of men who underestimate them. The first time I noticed her watching Kevin, I told myself I was being insecure. She stood too close at networking events. She finished his sentences during product demos. She spoke about long-term expansion as if she owned part of it. Kevin introduced her once as critical to scaling revenue acquisition. I remember smiling politely while she touched his arm and laughed at something that wasn't funny. Now her name sat inside a trust funded with my marital assets. I reopened the Delaware Business Registry and studied her LLC more carefully. Meridian Data Strategies, LLC. Formation date 3 months ago. Registered address in upscale apartment complex across town. 5 days after her LLC was formed. The trust was drafted. I mapped the dates again. LLC formation. Consulting retainer increases. Trust paperwork drafted. Separation strategy file created. The sequence wasn't emotional. It was operational. I accessed Kevin's startup filings and reviewed public disclosures. There was a new line item in recent internal reporting labeled Data Acquisition Consulting. The projected growth from that segment was impressive on paper. Investors would have loved it. What the report didn't show was where that consulting revenue flowed. The forensic spreadsheet I built on my laptop told a different story. Subscription revenue from Kevin's app was being routed through a growth allocation buffer before landing in operational accounts. A portion of that buffer was redirected to Meridian Data Strategies. Danielle's LLC wasn't a side business. It was a siphon. I searched my email archive for Danielle's name. I found old event invitations, follow-up notes from demo nights, one message from Kevin months ago forwarding her performance metrics with the caption, "She's a game changer." Game changer. I scrolled deeper into the shared drive and found draft correspondence between Kevin and Danielle. The tone wasn't romantic. It was strategic. Bullet points. Percentages. Timing windows. One email from Kevin read, "Once growth shifts, equity split won't matter." Danielle responded within minutes. "We just need to finalize the trust before formal changes." My pulse steadied instead of racing. Anger would have been easier. Clarity was colder. I leaned back and thought about the last investor dinner we hosted at our house. Danielle had stood in my kitchen pouring wine while Kevin explained future valuation projections in the living room. She spoke confidently about data scaling and customer acquisition cost reduction. I had admired her intelligence. She had been inside my house twice. I remembered how she complimented our dining table. "Solid wood," she said. "Built to last." Built to last. I reopened the separation strategy, Q3 document, and scrolled past the phased asset movement section. There was a draft amendment to our original prenup attached as an appendix. The amendment reclassified future startup equity growth as personal intellectual expansion rather than marital appreciation. If I had signed it, I would have been limited to early-stage valuation only. It was dated 2 weeks ago. He had not shown it to me. A digital sticky note attached to the draft read, "Have her sign during expansion celebration." Expansion celebration. I imagined Kevin opening champagne after closing a funding round, sliding paperwork across the table between laughter and congratulations, framing it as housekeeping, framing it as administrative cleanup. He would have smiled the way he smiled before leaving for San Francisco. I mapped the 6-week timeline across my spreadsheet again. Consulting transfers escalated just before the trust draft. The trust was labeled Phase 1. The separation strategy referenced Phase 2 involving additional buffering mechanisms. He wasn't planning to cheat and then figure out logistics. He was building logistics first. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for an upcoming product launch event. Danielle was listed as a featured partner. I stared at her name on the screen and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about comparing myself to her. It was about being quietly dismantled from the inside of my own marriage. Kevin had assumed I wouldn't read the fine print. He assumed branding and marketing meant I operated in surface language while he handled the real mechanics underneath. He underestimated how many contracts I reviewed in my own job, how many vendor agreements I negotiated, how often I scanned metadata and clauses before signing anything. I reopened the projected divorce settlement scenario inside the separation strategy file. It outlined a reduced asset allocation for me based on pre-moved revenue. The projected numbers were neat and clinical. Clean percentages. Controlled exposure. Post-trust funding valuation will lower exposure. One bullet point read, "Lower exposure." That was what I was to him. A liability to minimize. I closed the document and sat very still in the quiet of our townhouse. The afternoon light had shifted across the hardwood floors. The house felt different now, less like a shared space, more like a stage where something had been rehearsed behind the curtains. Kevin wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to leave me smaller than he found me. I scheduled the appointment the next morning. The law office sat in a quiet brick building in Raleigh, far enough from Charlotte to feel neutral, close enough to be practical. I chose the firm because their website listed high-asset divorce, forensic tracing, and corporate asset disputes. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for precision. When I sat across from Caroline Hayes, she didn't ask how I was feeling. She asked, "Do you have documentation?" I placed the folder on her desk. Trust activation confirmation. The forged signature. The Delaware LLC registration. The separation strategy Q3 draftee. The prenup amendment. The transaction spreadsheet I had built the night before. She flipped through each page without reacting. My husband opened a trust for another woman using marital business profits, I said evenly. And he attached my scanned signature. Caroline didn't blink. Do you have proof the signature was reused without active consent? I have the original refinance file and the trust document side by side. She nodded once and circled a section in the trust agreement. Phase 1 funding. That means there's likely a Phase 2, she said quietly. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear someone else say that. Caroline leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. Let's start with the basics. Was the startup formed during your marriage? Yes. And are distributions from that startup considered marital income? Yes. She nodded again. Then any redirection of those profits without lawful spousal consent could be classified as dissipation of marital funds. The phrase landed with weight. Dissipation. Not misunderstanding. Not miscommunication. If the signature was copied without authentication, she continued, the trust can be challenged, especially if the funding source is marital property. I felt something settle inside me. Not relief. Leverage. She asked about Kevin's investor trips, about governance structure, about equity allocation. I explained the consulting payments to Danielle's LLC, the growth allocation buffer, the projected divorce modeling. Caroline's pen paused over my spreadsheet. Does the board know about the trust? I don't believe so. If they don't, and investors are negotiating funding under incomplete disclosure, this expands beyond a marriage issue. The room felt colder. Meaning breach of fiduciary duty could come into play if profits were redirected for personal benefit. Kevin hadn't just underestimated me. He may have underestimated his own board. Caroline flipped to the prenup amendment draft. Did he present this to you? No. If he had, and you signed under celebration or pressure, your claim to future appreciation might have been severely limited. I imagined the champagne, the congratulatory smiles, the pen sliding toward me across the table. She closed the folder gently. What do you want? The question surprised me. I hadn't framed it that way yet. I don't know if reconciliation is even possible. I said honestly, but I know I won't be financially erased. Caroline nodded once. Then we moved strategically. She outlined the immediate steps. File a formal dispute to invalidate the trust based on improper consent. Submit a preservation notice to the startup to prevent further asset movement. Request full documentation of trust structure and funding. Timing is critical, she said. If there's a Phase 2 and funds move offshore or into layered entities, tracing becomes more complex. Kevin was scheduled to return from San Francisco in 2 days. We'll file electronically today, she continued. Once the trust dispute is submitted, the trustee must review consent validity. And if we notify startup counsel simultaneously, it triggers internal compliance review. Compliance review. Governance review. Words Kevin used casually in conversation were now mechanisms that could close around him. Caroline looked at me carefully. Understand something. Once this is filed, your husband will be notified. This is not subtle. It was never subtle, I replied quietly. She allowed the smallest hint of a smile. I signed the authorization forms. My name written in ink this time. Deliberate and controlled. Within the hour, the trust dispute was submitted. The preservation notice drafted and sent to startup legal counsel. Certified electronic delivery. Documented receipt. Caroline turned her screen toward me briefly. The trustee has acknowledged receipt. Funding will be reviewed pending consent verification. The clock had started. My phone buzzed with a text from Kevin. Meeting wrapped. Flying home Sunday. He thought he was returning with leverage. He thought he was closing deals while I stayed home admiring his ambition. Caroline printed a confirmation page and slid it across the desk. You've acted before Phase 2. That matters. I folded the paper and placed it inside my folder. When I stepped outside into the afternoon sun, the air felt clearer than it had in days. Not lighter, just sharper. Kevin believed he had weeks before I discovered the trust. He had less than 48 hours. Kevin texted me from San Francisco just after midnight. Meeting went better than expected. We're close. I stared at the message for a moment before typing back, "That's great. Proud of you." He responded with a thumbs up and a plane emoji. He had no idea the legal clock had already started ticking against him. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and opened my laptop. Caroline had emailed confirmation that the preservation notice was delivered to Kinetic Loop's legal counsel. Receipt acknowledged. Internal compliance review required. The language was calm, procedural, unemotional, exactly how I wanted it. I checked Kevin's LinkedIn. He had posted a photo from a rooftop bar in San Francisco. Skyline behind him. Caption: strategic expansion conversations. Big week ahead. The comments were congratulatory. Investors, advisors, other founders applauding his momentum. Momentum. I forwarded the post to Caroline. If investor negotiations are active while governance is under review, she replied. This increases exposure. They cannot claim transparency if material financial reallocation is undisclosed. I closed the message and opened my banking spreadsheet again. I traced the consulting transfers one more time, cross-referencing dates with Kevin's travel schedule. The pattern was too precise to be accidental. By mid-morning, Caroline called. Startup Council has responded, she said. They've requested documentation on all consulting payments tied to Meridian data strategies. My stomach tightened. Not from fear, but from anticipation. They're obligated to review once a marital asset preservation notice is filed. She continued, especially if the transfers overlap with trust funding. What does that mean for him? I asked. It means someone is about to ask questions he didn't prepare to answer. That afternoon, I received a forwarded internal email from Caroline's contact at the firm handling the notice. The CFO had flagged unusual growth allocation discrepancies during preliminary review. Consulting payments were being analyzed for compliance consistency. The phrase emergency governance discussion appeared in the subject line. Kevin called me around 5 in the evening. His voice was bright. We're aligning on valuation expectations, he said. Once this closes, nothing can touch us. Nothing can touch us. I pictured the preservation notice sitting in his startup counsel's inbox. The trust dispute logged in the trustees' system. The CFO's compliance flag. That's good, I said evenly. When do you fly back? Sunday night. I think we're locking in something big. He sounded certain. Secure. After we hung up, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar email address. It was Danielle. Can we talk privately? That was the entire message. No greeting. No explanation. I read it twice and felt something shift. The tone wasn't confident anymore. It wasn't strategic. It was anxious. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to Caroline. An hour later, Caroline called again. The trustee has provisionally frozen Phase 1 funding pending consent verification. Frozen. Does Kevin know? I asked. Trustees are required to notify all involved parties when a dispute is filed, she said. He will? That night, I opened Danielle's LinkedIn profile. Comments were disabled. Her most recent post had been deleted. The Meridian Data Strategies website returned an error page. She was scrambling. I sat at the dining table where Kevin and I had signed our refinance paperwork years ago. The house was quiet. The same stillness from the morning I opened the trust email. I opened Kevin's shared drive folder again and scanned for new activity. The separation strategy document hadn't been modified since he left for San Francisco, but a new file appeared. Investor Valuation Adjustment Notes. I didn't open it yet. I didn't need to. Another email from Caroline arrived just before midnight. Startup Legal has called an emergency executive session for Monday morning. Attendance mandatory. Kevin was flying home Sunday night. He believed he was returning with leverage, with expansion, with a narrative about protecting our future. He didn't know that by the time his plane landed, his board would already be reviewing trust documentation, consulting transfers, and governance disclosures. He didn't know the trustee had marked the trust under irregular consent documentation. He didn't know Danielle had already reached out to me. Sunday evening. My phone buzzed again as his flight began boarding. Everything is lining up perfectly, he wrote. I looked at the stack of printed confirmations on the counter beside me. Trust dispute filed. Preservation notice delivered. Trustee freeze acknowledged. Perfect alignment. I thought, just not the kind he expected. Kevin believed he was flying home with control. He was flying home into an investigation. Kevin walked through the front door Sunday evening with the kind of smile that belongs to someone who believes he has already won. He dropped his suitcase by the stairs, loosened his tie, and leaned in to kiss my cheek like nothing in the air had shifted. He smelled like airport coffee and expensive cologne. You would not believe how close this is, he said, heading straight to the kitchen. We're aligning valuation tiers. It's bigger than we expected. I watched him pour himself a drink. His movements loose, confident, unaware. The house felt still around him. Controlled. We might need to restructure ownership tiers before the next funding round, he continued. Just to protect everything properly. Protect everything properly. I folded my hands on the dining table and let him talk. He moved through phrases like strategic insulation and preemptive structuring, words he had used for months, words I had once accepted without scrutiny. You trust me, right? He said suddenly, glancing at me over the rim of his glass. The same line. The same steady eye contact. I need clarity, I said quietly. He frowned. Confused but still relaxed. About what? I stood up, walked to the kitchen counter, and picked up the stack of printed documents. When I returned to the table, I placed the trust activation confirmation directly in front of him. His smile faltered. For a moment, he didn't touch the paper. Then he looked down and saw Danielle's name. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It's just a consulting structure, he said too quickly. You're misunderstanding what that is. I slid the second page toward him. The page with my signature. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize my own name? I asked. The room went silent. He picked up the paper and stared at it as if seeing it for the first time. This is standard digital filing, he said. It's procedural. Procedural consent requires authentication, I replied. Which you didn't have. His eyes flicked up to mine. I let the words land before continuing. The trust has been disputed. The funding is frozen. Startup legal counsel has been notified. A preservation notice is in place. The confidence drained from his posture in real time. You what? An emergency governance review is scheduled for Monday morning. He stood up abruptly, chair scraping against hardwood. You had no right to escalate this without talking to me. You escalated it the moment you used my signature, I said evenly. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. This isn't what you think. The trust was temporary. Danielle's LLC is legitimate consulting. You don't understand the mechanics. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You're right, I said calmly. I didn't understand the mechanics until I read them. He stopped pacing. You went through my files. I went through our marital assets. His phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and then quickly turned it face down. You went to a lawyer, he said slowly. Accusation mixing with disbelief. Yes. For what? To destroy everything? To protect what you tried to move. He stared at me like I was someone unfamiliar. You're blowing this out of proportion. Investors expect restructuring. This is how scaling works. Scaling doesn't involve copying a 7-year-old refinance signature into a trust for your romantic partner. His face tightened. Danielle is business. She's listed as beneficiary. That was a placeholder. For $150,000. He exhaled sharply, as if I were being unreasonable. You're making this personal. It was personal the moment you built a separation strategy modeling my reduced settlement. That stopped him. Completely. How do you... He cut himself off. I read the file, I said. Transfer growth upside before filing. Limit exposure. Phase 2 buffering. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. The phone buzzed again. This time he looked at it longer. A flicker of something, fear, crossed his face. Startup Council has questions, I said quietly. About consulting payments. About governance disclosure. He sank slowly into the chair across from me. You didn't have to go this far. You shouldn't have gone that far first. For the first time since this began, I saw calculation shift into panic. He was running scenarios in his head, reevaluating timelines, assessing risk. What do you want? He asked finally. I want every transfer traced, I said. He swallowed. And if I refuse? You can't. Not anymore. I explained the equity structure. How startup shares issued during our marriage were marital property. How dissipation of marital funds before divorce could shift asset division percentages dramatically in family court. How scanned signatures without authentication weaken trust validity. His shoulders lowered inch by inch as I spoke. He had always believed he handled the architecture of power in our marriage. That I managed surface details while he built structure underneath. Now he understood that I had read the blueprint. You're humiliating me, he said quietly. No, I replied. I'm holding you accountable. The kitchen light reflected off the stack of papers between us. My name printed clearly. My signature reclaimed in ink where I had signed the dispute authorization earlier that week. Kevin stared at the documents as if they were something dangerous. For 12 years, he had believed I was the quieter half of this marriage. The softer one. The one who trusted complexity without questioning it. He was wrong. And for the first time since he started planning his exit, he understood that I was not the obstacle he could maneuver around. I was the variable he failed to measure. Monday morning arrived without drama. Just a tight stillness that sat between us like a third presence at the kitchen table. Kevin barely spoke while he dressed. He checked his phone twice. Jaw tight, eyes scanning notifications. I poured coffee and watched the steam rise in the quiet. At 8:15, my phone vibrated with an email from Caroline. Trust officially frozen pending investigation. Notice delivered to all listed parties. All listed parties included Danielle. Kevin's phone buzzed at the same time. He looked down, and whatever he read made his face pale. They froze it, he said, not looking at me. Yes, I replied. He slipped his phone into his pocket and walked toward the door without another word. After he left, I sat down with my laptop and opened the forwarded legal correspondence Caroline had sent overnight. Startup Council had acknowledged the preservation notice. The CFO had flagged unusual consulting allocations tied to Meridian data strategies. A governance review meeting had been scheduled for 9:30. Attendance mandatory. I imagined Kevin walking into the glass-walled conference room, expecting to discuss investor alignment, only to find compliance documentation waiting for him instead. At 9:52, Caroline called. It's tense, she said calmly. They're reviewing transfer records in real time. Is he denying it? I asked. He's framing it as strategic consulting compensation. That won't hold. No, she agreed. Not once the timeline is shown. An hour later, she forwarded me a summary from someone inside the board session. The CFO had presented a chart of diverted subscription revenue. The percentage increases aligned precisely with the trust draft date. One board member had asked directly whether a romantic partner was involved in financial restructuring. I could picture Kevin's expression when that question was asked. My email pinged again, this time from Danielle. We need to speak immediately. I was told everything was already separated. Her tone had changed completely. No polish, no confidence, just urgency. I didn't respond. I forwarded the message to Caroline. Good, she said when she called back. Let her panic. It means she understands exposure. By early afternoon, another update arrived. The board had initiated a temporary governance review. Kevin was required to disclose all side agreements tied to consulting payments. His unilateral authority over financial restructuring decisions was suspended pending investigation. Suspended. Kevin called me around 3. His voice was sharp, strained. What did you tell them? He demanded. The truth, I said. You've humiliated me in front of my own board. You used my name without consent. You didn't have to involve investors. I didn't. The structure did. There was a long silence. I could hear muffled voices in the background. The echo of a hallway. Danielle is stepping back temporarily, he said finally. Of course she is. You've put her in a position she never asked for. She registered the LLC. He didn't answer that. When he came home that evening, he looked 10 years older. The easy confidence from the airport was gone. He dropped his briefcase without the usual care and leaned against the counter. They're reviewing everything? He said quietly. Every transfer. Every agreement. That's what audits are for. He laughed once. But there was no humor in it. You don't understand what this does to investor confidence. I understand exactly what hidden assets do to investor confidence. His shoulders sagged. You didn't have to go this far. You shouldn't have built it this far. Another email arrived while we stood there. Caroline had filed a formal discovery request for forensic accounting. Full tracing of startup profit allocations over the last 6 months. Kevin's phone buzzed moments later. He glanced at the screen and closed his eyes briefly. They're restricting my access to certain accounts until the review finishes, he said. For the first time. There was no anger in his voice. Only realization. Later that night, I checked Danielle's public profiles. Her association with Kinetic Loop had been removed. The Meridian Data Strategies website displayed a temporary inactivity notice. A former colleague of Kevin's messaged me privately. I don't want to get involved. But Danielle bragged about locking in security before divorce. I stared at the message for a long moment before forwarding it to Caroline. The house felt different that night. Not shattered. Not broken. Just exposed. Kevin sat across from me at the kitchen table, phone buzzing every few minutes with legal notifications. He looked smaller somehow, as if the architecture he had built around himself was narrowing. You're destroying everything, he said quietly. I'm protecting what you tried to move, I replied. He stared at me as if trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the one sitting across from him now. For months, he had believed he was the only one capable of playing long strategy, the only one who understood how to shift numbers quietly. Now the trust was frozen. The board was reviewing. The transfers were being traced. For the first time since he began planning his exit, Kevin understood something he had never calculated. I was not the obstacle. I was the variable he failed to measure. The forensic accountant's report arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a file so clinical it almost felt detached from the life it was about to dismantle. I opened it at the dining table where Kevin and I had once discussed vacation plans and grocery lists. The cover page read Revenue Flow Analysis, Preliminary Findings. There was nothing emotional about the language inside. Just numbers, percentages, arrows mapping where subscription income traveled after entering Kinetic Loop's operating accounts. The first chart showed the growth allocation buffer Kevin had described as temporary scaling strategy. From there, a portion of revenue diverted to Meridian Data Strategies, LLC, under consulting justification. The allocation percentage increased precisely 1 week after the trust draft was completed. It wasn't random. It wasn't a rounding error. It was patterned. I followed the lines on the chart slowly. Subscription income. Buffer. Consulting payment. Trust seed allocation. Phase 1 funding had not been symbolic. It had been fueled directly by redirected profit. Caroline called while I was still staring at the page. This is intentional, she said without hesitation. The percentage escalation proves structure. Kevin came home later that evening with a different kind of exhaustion than before. He didn't speak immediately. He poured water instead of whiskey. They've appointed an interim oversight committee, he said quietly. I can't authorize financial transfers without secondary approval. I slid the printed forensic summary across the table toward him. They found the buffer, I said. He looked at the page, eyes scanning, jaw tightening. It's standard growth allocation, he replied. But the conviction wasn't there. It increased the week after the trust was drafted. He didn't respond. Later that night, I received an updated batch of discovery documents. Internal emails between Kevin and Danielle. Clean subject lines. Clean formatting. No obvious romance. Just strategy. One email from Kevin outlined projected divorce outcomes under various valuation scenarios. He described how equity dilution could reduce marital division exposure if revenue shifted before formal filing. Danielle responded with bullet points of her own. Suggested timing windows. Reminders about Phase 2 clearance. In one message she wrote, "Once Phase 2 clears, she won't be able to touch it." I read the sentence twice. Not because it shocked me, but because it confirmed the calculation had been shared. Danielle had claimed she thought everything was already separated. The emails told a different story. The draft prenup amendment was now part of the forensic file as well. Caroline explained that if Kevin had convinced me to sign it during a funding celebration, my claim to future startup appreciation would have been dramatically reduced. The document attempted to reclassify growth as post-marital intellectual expansion. Clean language designed to sound reasonable. It was saved the same night Kevin booked his San Francisco trip. I imagined the champagne, the congratulations, the pen placed gently in my hand. He hadn't planned to argue with me. He had planned to outmaneuver me. The next day, Caroline informed me that the startup board had received the preliminary forensic findings. Investor confidence was fragile. Compliance had flagged potential conflict of interest exposure due to Danielle's romantic involvement and her LLC's revenue link. Kevin's voting rights on restructuring proposals were temporarily restricted. He didn't yell this time when he came home. He didn't accuse. He didn't posture. "Are you filing for divorce?" he asked instead. I looked at him carefully before answering. "You filed first," I said. "You just didn't submit the paperwork." He leaned against the counter, hands braced on the surface. "I never meant to hurt you. You meant to minimize me." "That's not true." "You modeled settlement scenarios." Silence stretched between us. Danielle formally dissolved her consulting agreement the following week. Meridian Data Strategies filed amended paperwork reducing activity. Her attorney contacted Caroline requesting cooperative resolution and distance from further exposure. The trust remained frozen. The forensic report expanded to include cumulative totals. The diverted amount exceeded the original $150,000 seeded into the trust. It was no longer just about the trust. It was about the system built around it. Kevin's projected expansion bonus was tied to compliance clearance he might not receive. Investors requested valuation stabilization before proceeding with new capital. One afternoon, while I was reviewing additional documents, Kevin sat across from me and said quietly, "I didn't think you'd look that closely." I met his eyes. "That was your mistake." The house no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a ledger. Every action recorded. Every transfer traceable. He had assumed complexity would shield him. That legal language and layered accounts would obscure intent. Instead, the very structure he built had become the evidence against him. Kevin didn't just risk our marriage. He built an entire exit strategy on the assumption that I would never follow the money. The mediation room smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warming plate. Kevin sat across from me at a rectangular glass table, his attorney to his right, Caroline to mine. The blinds were half drawn, letting in thin stripes of afternoon light. There were no raised voices, no dramatic entrances, just paperwork stacked in orderly piles and a digital recorder placed in the center of the table. "This can still be resolved amicably," Kevin's attorney began, folding his hands with practiced calm. "Amicably." Caroline didn't respond immediately. She slid a folder forward instead. "We're prepared to proceed constructively," she said. "But the record must reflect the scope of financial dissipation." The word landed in the room like a weight. Kevin's jaw tightened. He avoided looking directly at me. Caroline outlined our position clearly. The trust invalid due to improper consent. The documented diversion of marital business profits into a consulting LLC tied to a romantic partner. The forensic accounting trail establishing intent and escalation. Kevin's attorney shifted slightly in his chair. "Our client acknowledges certain missteps," he said carefully. "However, this was business restructuring, not malicious concealment." Caroline slid a printed chart across the table. The diversion percentage increased within days of the trust draft, she replied. And the internal email correspondence references post-funding insulation prior to divorce filing. Kevin's eyes flicked up at that. We'd prefer not to escalate into public litigation. His attorney continued. For everyone's benefit. For everyone's benefit, I repeated softly. There was a brief pause while the mediator suggested private caucus sessions. Kevin and his attorney stepped into an adjacent office. The door closed behind them. Caroline turned to me. He's trying to contain discovery, she said quietly. If this goes to court, internal emails become public record. I nodded. I wasn't interested in spectacle. I was interested in correction. When Kevin returned to the table, the edge in his posture had softened. He avoided my eyes at first. We're willing to dissolve the trust entirely, he said. All funds returned. No further involvement with Meridian data strategies. Caroline's expression didn't change. That addresses the trust. It does not address diverted revenue or attempted prenup modification. Kevin's attorney cleared his throat. We propose equitable distribution of current startup valuation and structured compensation. Caroline placed another document on the table. The forensic timeline. Every consulting payment listed by date and amount. Kevin stared at it for a long moment. If this proceeds to litigation, Caroline said calmly, the court may consider intentional dissipation. That could significantly alter asset division percentages. Silence settled over the table. Danielle's attorney was present only by phone. Speaker placed near the mediator. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. My client was advised that assets were already separated, she said. Caroline read aloud one email from the discovery file. Once Phase 2 clears, she won't be able to touch it. The room went quiet again. Danielle's attorney cleared his throat. We would like to formalize my client's withdrawal from all associated entities. Kevin finally looked at me directly. This isn't who I am, he said quietly. It is, I replied. It's who you chose to be. The mediator suggested another break. This time Kevin stayed seated. What do you want? He asked. Voice lower. Stripped of arrogance. Transparency, I said. And what's legally mine? Caroline outlined the settlement demands without hesitation. Majority equity allocation reflecting current valuation. Anti-dilution protection preventing future manipulation. Compensation for diverted funds. Formal acknowledgement of trust invalidation and withdrawal of consulting arrangement. Kevin's attorney scribbled notes rapidly. You're asking for control, Kevin said. I'm asking for accountability. He leaned back in his chair. Eyes closed briefly as if recalculating a model in his head. If we agree to these terms, his attorney said slowly, there will be no public fraud filing. Provided compliance continues and financial transparency is maintained. Caroline answered. The mediator looked between us. Do we have movement? Kevin's attorney requested a sidebar. They stepped into the hallway. Through the frosted glass, I could see Kevin gesturing sharply, then stopping abruptly. When they returned, the shift was visible. We're prepared to accept majority equity reallocation, his attorney said, with conditions regarding operational involvement. Caroline nodded. Operational involvement can remain, subject to governance oversight. Danielle's attorney confirmed on speaker that her client would formally disclaim any beneficiary claim and dissolve Meridian data strategies. The edges of the war were folding inward. Kevin looked at me again. Not angry. Not defiant. Just tired. I didn't think you'd take it this far, he said. You already had, I replied. The mediation adjourned pending final drafting. As we gathered our papers, Kevin lingered for a moment. I thought I was protecting my future, he said quietly. You were protecting it from me, I answered. He didn't argue. For months, he had believed power meant moving money in silence. Now he understood that power meant knowing how to stop it. The draft settlement agreement arrived on a gray Wednesday morning. Thicker than I expected and heavier than it looked. I sat across from Caroline in her office while she turned each page slowly, marking clauses with a pen. The first section referenced acknowledgement of financial dissipation risk and voluntary resolution to avoid extended litigation. Voluntary. Kevin hadn't volunteered anything until leverage forced his hand. The equity reallocation clause came next. The startup shares issued during our marriage were recalculated based on current valuation, not the reduced exposure scenario he had modeled in his separation strategy document. I would hold majority control of the marital equity block. There was also an anti-dilution provision. Any future restructuring or additional funding round could not reduce my percentage without written disclosure and opportunity to contest. He can't move around you anymore, Caroline said quietly. Operationally, Kevin would remain involved with Kinetic Loop. But governance oversight would stay in place. An independent compliance monitor would review major financial decisions for 12 months. The trust section was brief but decisive. The Montgomery Growth Trust would be formally dissolved. The trustee had already suspended funding pending investigation. The agreement confirmed invalid consent and voided beneficiary status. Danielle would sign a non-participation affidavit acknowledging withdrawal and disclaiming any future claim tied to marital assets. I didn't feel satisfaction reading her name in that context. Just closure. The forensic accounting summary was attached as an exhibit. Total diverted funds were listed precisely. Kevin agreed to reimburse the marital estate from personal compensation, including future performance bonuses until the balance was reconciled. His projected expansion bonus was now tied to compliance certification clearance. Everything was structured, transparent, documented. Kevin arrived at Caroline's office later that afternoon to review the draft. He looked composed but restrained. Like someone navigating terrain he once believed he controlled. He sat across from me again, though this time without mediation formality. Just 4 chairs and a stack of legal pages. His attorney flipped through the document slowly. "We've reviewed the terms," he said. "My client is prepared to sign pending minor language clarifications." Caroline nodded. "The language is precise for a reason." Kevin looked at the equity clause longer than the others. "This gives you majority leverage," he said quietly. "It gives me protection," I replied. He didn't argue. When we reached the trust dissolution section, his eyes paused. "This didn't have to collapse like this," he said. "It didn't," I answered. "It didn't have to exist at all." Silence settled in the room. He signed first. His signature steady. Controlled, this time written under observation, not copied from a cloud archive. When the papers were slid toward me, I held the pen carefully. My name flowed across the page in real ink. Deliberate. Witnessed. The trust would never exist beyond documentation. The consulting arrangement with Meridian Data Strategies would dissolve. The startup would continue under oversight rather than secrecy. Outside the legal office, the air felt cooler than it had in months. Later that evening, Kevin asked to speak privately before leaving. "I never meant for it to spiral," he said. "I was thinking about scaling, about protecting the company, by protecting it from me." He exhaled slowly. "I thought you didn't understand the mechanics." I met his eyes evenly. "That was your assumption." He looked down at his hands. Ambition clouded judgment. "No," I said. "Ego did." He didn't disagree. The following week, the startup board finalized governance reforms. Investor confidence stabilized cautiously. The compliance monitor remained active. Kevin retained his title but no longer had unilateral financial authority. Danielle disappeared from all company materials. Her LLC filed dissolution paperwork. Her name no longer appeared in growth strategy decks or consulting projections. The house felt different as well. Not fragile. Not bitter. Just reorganized. We had built a marriage on shared ambition. Somewhere along the way, he had decided ambition required secrecy. The settlement didn't feel like revenge in the cinematic sense. It felt like correction. A recalibration of power that should never have shifted in the first place. One evening, as we reviewed final court filing confirmations, Kevin sat quietly at the edge of the sofa. "You're going to walk away with more than I expected," he said. "I'm walking away with what was already mine," I replied. He nodded once. For months, he believed he was constructing a future that didn't require me. He believed he could restructure equity, redirect profits, and reclassify growth without consequence. Now his future depended on the very clauses he once tried to manipulate. The settlement would be filed within days. The trust dissolved. The equity redistributed. The transfers reconciled. Kevin once believed he was building leverage. Now he understood that leverage works both ways. The court hearing was brief, almost anticlimactic after months of tension that had stretched like wire beneath every conversation. Kevin and I sat at separate tables in the family courtroom, the atmosphere quieter than mediation had been. There were no raised voices here, no strategic pauses, just formalities and finality. The judge reviewed the settlement terms carefully. Majority equity allocation, trust dissolution, reimbursement structure for diverted funds, compliance oversight attached to business governance. Both parties entered this agreement voluntarily. The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor, Kevin's attorney answered. Yes, Caroline confirmed. The judge looked at Kevin directly. You understand the implications of financial dissipation findings had this proceeded to full litigation? Kevin nodded. I do. There was no defiance left in his posture. No attempt to reframe what had happened as strategic necessity. The judge signed the order with steady efficiency. The settlement is approved. Just like that. Months of secrecy and calculated movement were reduced to a few pages stamped and filed. Outside the courthouse, the sky was sharp and bright. Kevin walked beside me in silence for several steps before stopping near the curb. I never imagined it would end like this, he said. I did, I replied quietly. He looked at me, searching my face for something. Anger, grief, regret. What do you feel? He asked. I considered the question carefully. Clarity. He gave a faint, almost incredulous smile. That's all. That's enough. In the weeks that followed, the practical realities of the settlement unfolded. The trust paperwork was officially voided and archived. The funds originally seeded were returned and accounted for. The compliance monitor issued the first quarterly review for Kinetic Loop. Revenue streams were stabilized under transparent allocation rules. Investor updates emphasized governance improvements rather than growth projections. Kevin's expansion bonus was adjusted pending compliance certification. The board required him to present restructuring proposals with full disclosure moving forward. The system he once navigated alone now required witnesses. Danielle's name never resurfaced publicly. Her affidavit of non-participation closed her connection to the marital estate permanently. Meridian Data Strategies ceased operations entirely. I didn't follow her life beyond that. Revenge had never been about her. It had been about the architecture of power Kevin believed he controlled. One evening, as I packed a small box of personal files to store, Kevin stood in the doorway of the office that had once been locked against me. I underestimated you, he said simply. You underestimated the law, I corrected. And you? He paused, then added, I thought I was being smart. You were being secretive. There was no bitterness in my voice. Just fact. I was afraid, he admitted after a moment. Of what? Of losing leverage. I closed the box and stood. You lost trust instead. He nodded slowly, as if finally understanding the difference. Months earlier, he had spoken about building a future for both of us while quietly designing one without me. Now, the future looked different for both of us. Separate. Structured. Transparent. The townhouse felt quieter as we prepared to sell it. We divided furniture without argument. The kitchen table where I had opened the forensic report would not follow either of us. It would be replaced by something new, in another space. On the day the final financial reconciliation cleared, Caroline called with confirmation. All transfers reconciled, she said. Your equity position is secure. Secure. It wasn't the word Kevin had once used when he described the trust, but it felt more honest now. Later that week, Kevin sent me an email, not legal, not strategic, personal. I let ambition become manipulation. I thought protecting assets meant moving them out of reach. I didn't see that I was moving away from you instead. I'm sorry. I read it once, then closed it. Forgiveness wasn't required for resolution. The greatest betrayal had not been the affair itself. It had been the assumption that I would never understand what he was doing. That I would never notice revenue shifts, never question signatures, never follow numbers. He had mistaken silence for ignorance. I had mistaken partnership for permanence. The difference between us was that I learned quickly. Kevin once believed that leverage meant controlling information. He forgot that knowledge travels both ways. 9 months after the settlement was approved, I stood in a different kitchen, in a different part of the city, holding a cup of coffee that tasted like something steady. The condo was smaller than the townhouse Kevin and I once shared, but it felt intentional. Every piece of furniture had been chosen by me. Every account attached to my name was transparent, monitored, understood. Kinetic Loop had stabilized. The compliance monitor issued its final quarterly report without red flags. Investor confidence returned cautiously, not because of explosive growth, but because governance reforms held firm. Kevin retained his role, but not his autonomy. He sent one final email the week the oversight period ended. I've been thinking about how easily I convinced myself that restructuring meant security. I didn't realize I was restructuring my marriage out of existence. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to negotiate. The trust that once existed only as a hidden instrument was now a cautionary footnote in archived documents. The Montgomery Growth Trust never matured. It never sheltered diverted revenue. It never became the safety net Kevin believed would insulate him from marital division. What remained was clarity. I sometimes replayed the moment I opened that confirmation email months ago. The subject line, the quiet shock, the choice not to confront him immediately. Revenge, in the way people imagine it, would have been louder. Public accusations, explosive arguments. Instead, I chose documentation. I chose to follow the numbers. I chose to understand the law better than the man who believed I wouldn't bother. That was the true shift in power. Kevin once believed betrayal meant secrecy wrapped in complexity. That if the architecture was layered enough, I would never see its foundation. He forgot that complexity leaves trails. He forgot that marriage is not just romance and routine. It is financial partnership, shared equity, legal alignment. The most dangerous betrayal is not infidelity alone. It is the quiet transfer of power away from the person standing beside you. And the most effective revenge is not destruction. It is correction. I did not ruin his company. I did not broadcast our private conflict. I did not chase humiliation. I held him accountable within the framework he thought he could manipulate. I used the system he trusted to expose him. That difference matters. In the months that followed, I rebuilt slowly, not just financially, but personally. I reviewed every account tied to my name. I met with advisors independently. I strengthened my understanding of marital property law, asset division, and financial governance. Not because I planned to repeat this story, but because knowledge is armor. Kevin once told me he was building a future for both of us. He was building insulation for himself. The irony is that the very tools he used, legal documents, trusts, equity structures, became the instruments that protected me instead. When I look back now, I don't feel anger. I feel awareness. Awareness of how easily ambition can slide into manipulation. Awareness of how quickly partnership can become hierarchy if one person believes the other isn't paying attention. He underestimated my ability to understand money. He underestimated my ability to read legal language. He underestimated my willingness to act. That was the only miscalculation that mattered. If there's one lesson I carry from this family drama, it's this: never assume silence equals ignorance. Never assume trust removes the need for transparency. And never believe that revenge must be loud to be powerful. Sometimes revenge is a signature placed deliberately on a document that restores balance. Sometimes revenge is a calm voice across a mediation table saying, "What you moved was never yours alone." Sometimes revenge is simply knowing the law better than the person who tried to use it against you. I don't tell this story because I enjoy revisiting betrayal. I tell it because too many women are told they don't need to understand the financial mechanics inside their own marriages. You do. You always do. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt that something didn't add up, that money was moving quietly, that decisions were being made without you, pay attention. Ask questions. Read the documents. Follow the numbers. And if you believe in justice that doesn't scream but stands firm, stay with me. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done. Subscribe if you value stories about hidden power, family drama, and the kind of revenge that doesn't destroy but corrects. Because sometimes the strongest response to betrayal isn't chaos. It's clarity.